Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
Let's go ahead and get into our true crime case for today.
So grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, or your wine if it's the evening. But either way, let's get into it. Today's episode takes us outside of the United States, but the story we're going to tell is one that Black families everywhere will recognize. It's about a little boy, a walk home that should have been ordinary, and a system that failed him at every single turn. But before we talk about the crime, before we talk about the courtrooms and we talk about the convictions, we need to talk about a little boy, a child who was deeply loved, and his name was Damilola Taylor. This story doesn't begin in London. It begins thousands of miles away with a phone call that would shatter a father's world. In November of 2000, Richard Taylor was at work in Nigeria when he received a call from London. It was odd for him to receive personal calls at work, but when he answered, a voice on the other end of the line told him the unthinkable. Damilola, his son, had been killed. Richard collapsed. What happened? How could this happen? Is all he could think about.
Damilola was just a child, only 10 years old. His parents were Richard and Gloria Taylor. He was gentle, optimistic, and curious about the world. He followed the rules and loved school. He grew up in the comfort of Nigeria. He dreamed of becoming a doctor. Then his family relocated to London. As it often goes, immigrant families relocate for something better, better opportunities. And for Damilola's family, they relocated to London to hopefully provide his sister with better physicians to treat her severe epilepsy. That move changed everything. The family went from stability to uncertainty almost overnight.
The Taylor family was placed in public housing at the North Peckham estate in South London. The estate had a reputation: poor lighting, broken security doors, stairwells that echoed, cameras that didn't work. Residents complained for years. And this is where the story begins to feel eerily familiar to our stories here in the States. Because when Black families raise concerns about safety, they're often labeled as complainers instead of parents trying to protect their children. And the frustrations with safety didn't stop simply at the public housing. Damilola was the new kid on the block. In a new culture with people that didn't look like him and teen gangs that tried to convince him to be a part of their clique, Damilola wanted no parts of this. He loved school. He was that kid that would leave school and then go to the library to study some more and learn more. And this subjected him to bullying and intimidation. And yet he stayed hopeful. Damilola was determined to make his new living arrangement work. When his father would ask if he wanted to come back to Nigeria, Damilola earnestly said no. He wanted to stay with his brother, his sister, and his mother. He joined an after-school club, so he joined a school computer club and sought to ignore the bullying of those around him. But on November 27th, 2000, just 3 months after moving to London, Damilola left school. And like any regular day, he went to the library to attend his after school computer club. Once he left the library, he followed his normal route to go home. It was really close from the library to his house. And there's CCTV footage that will show Damilola hopping and skipping, full of joy of a carefree childhood. He had no concern in the world. He was carrying his school bag. He was dressed in his school uniform. As he approached the building where he lived, he was viciously attacked.
In the North Peckham estate area, Amiola entered a stairwell. just yards away from his home when he was approached. What happened next was not fully witnessed, but the outcome was devastating. The police believe a teenage gang tried to rob Damilola for his silver jacket and, in the process, stabbed him in the leg with a broken bottle. But this wasn't an ordinary wound, it was deep and severed a major artery, which we have a long major artery that goes out the inner parts of our legs that carries blood. It pumps blood to our heart and circulates all throughout our system. So if that's severed, much like the carotid artery, it's pretty much a wrap. There's almost nothing you can do because you just bleed out too quickly for you to get help. And that's the femoral artery that I'm referring to. Viola tried to go toward help, but he collapsed in the stairwell of the housing estate where he slowly bled to death. A nearby stranger saw the trail of blood, followed it, and found Damiola in the stairwell dying. He called 999, their version of 911, and desperately tried to get help there while also sitting with Damiola and trying to reassure him that everything would be okay. Damiola's last words were, "I'm okay." Remember, Damiola was just 10 years old. He was trying to make it home. He tried to go toward help, but then he collapses and was found just yards from his front door. Can you imagine your child so close to safety and still not making it to you?
When police arrived, the shock was immediate, but so were the assumptions. Media outlets quickly framed the estate as violent, dangerous, overrun by gangs. Instead of centering on Damilola's as a victim, the media's narrative shifted to criminalizing Black youth who lived in the same neighborhood. Children who looked like him became suspects. The outrage was immediate, and Damilola's photograph became a symbol, a little boy with a smile. A nation was devastated and demanded justice. But the police were vigilant to seek justice for Damilola. They secured the crime scene, reviewed CCTV footage, and canvassed the area consistently. They arrested and released 11 people in the first few weeks. I mean, I think that that is outrageous. Like that in just a matter of weeks, they arrested 11 people. And we'll talk and discuss a little later in this show the differences between the UK and their criminal system and the United States. But when the police canvassed the area, they found either people that were unwilling to talk because they just simply didn't trust the police, or people that wanted to talk but was fearful of retribution. That's not at all different from what we see here in the States. And even though they didn't have immediate success, 8 months after Damilola's death, the police found what they believed to be their perpetrators, a girl named Bromley, known as Bromley. I don't know if that was her actual name or if that's just a name that she went by. Bromley came forward and she told the police that she witnessed the entire event. Not only did she say she saw, did, but she named the four individuals that she claimed attacked Damilola. The police were ecstatic, as you could obviously imagine. Finally, someone willing to talk and with details that would solve the crime. But the ending wasn't as the police expected.
After the police arrested all four suspects, Bromley's story started to change. In fact, it changed multiple times. On top of her story ever changing, Bromley demanded to have inducements, which is an exchange. I give the police something for exchange of the information that I have. Yet the case still proceeded to trial against the four suspects. MD, I want to ask you, did she ever get the inducements that she wanted? Did they follow that?
Yes, they absolutely
They
did. They
they
gave
did
her
follow
because,
that.
for them, devil's advocate, because I'm sure a lot of you are sitting there thinking, what? We do something similar here in the States, and it's a plea arrangement or a plea agreement, or, usually it's somebody that's trying to get off. It's
Mhm.
somebody that is associated with the crime and could be criminally charged for the crime. However, in exchange for my information, you're gonna not sentence me. Or we've seen situations, and Steph's talked about situations where a witness in jail has overheard this person confessing, and in exchange for my testimony, you give me a lighter sentence. And so that's similar. But what's interesting about this particular case, or with this inducement, is Bromley wasn't a criminal. There was nothing that she could have been charged for. She was according to her testimony, a witness to the events, not somebody that was perpetrating the event.
Right, but for me, I'm looking at her sideways. You know what I mean? Because if you didn't have anything to do with it, if you have no dog in this fight, as you say, you're just an upstanding citizen, why do you need any inducements?
And that's the problem with giving inducements in this particular way. When you do it, when it's somebody that doesn't have a dog in the fight, like you say, or where you could not be criminally charged, all you're doing is just coming forward and giving information. Why do you need something? I mean, now we have situations, Steph, in the States where, let's say, a man's wife, we have a similar case here recently where a man's wife went missing, right? Went viral all over TikTok. And he woke up, or, when he came home, his wife wasn't there. And he's demanding, please help me find my wife. In a case like that, maybe the police, the FBI, or even the victim's family says, we'll give anybody $50,000 for coming forward and sharing any kind of information that could help us find our victim. And so we do inducements in that way, and that's more palatable. But even then, I think some people look at that sideways, like, why you just won't come tell this information? Why won't you, just for the good of humanity, for the good of the case, come forward? And Steph, you're going to tell us about how this really kind of blows up in the police's face.
Right. Now, when the court heard about these inducements, the judge chastised the police and criticized them for giving gifts in exchange for Bromley's testimony. On top of that, the judge threw Bromley out as a witness, stating she was far from credible and even more a liar that could not be trusted. Yikes. So
Yikes.
the entire
Exactly.
case fell
Gone.
apart. All
Gone.
four defendants walked free. The Taylor family was absolutely devastated.
And, I want to say, and we'll talk again, I promise that we're going to do a deeper dive at the end of this case about the differences and like how these four suspects even went to trial with only the testimony of Bromley. But yeah, the judge was like, absolutely not. You cannot give gifts in exchange for testimony for a witness where there's nothing else that's causing her to give this testimony. Testimony continued to change. It's not even like she came, hey, I want y'all to give me $50,000. And I'm just going to make up a number. I want y'all to give me $50,000 for me to give this testimony. Problematic. But what makes this even more problematic is that her testimony continued to change throughout the trial. So the judge is like, not only are you not credible because you took inducements, but also you're a liar because your story keeps changing. And I think that's pretty, for a judge to say something, to go as far as to say you're a liar, that's damning. To say you're not credible, it's a cute way, it's the legal way to say you're lying. But he went a step further and said, no, you're actually lying. So the police were back to the drawing board. They had to figure this out. Like, who committed this heinous crime against Damilola? And rightfully so, they no longer believed Bromley and the four initial suspects that she painted. And so they were no longer even persons of interest. 4 years go by, and so it's now January 2005, and the police have three suspects that they're pretty sure is linked to this crime. But this time they want to do it right. They have two, and two of the suspects were actually brothers. But the police decide, okay, we're going to not just believe that these suspects are responsible. We're going to see if we can send the forensic evidence that we've collected from the crime scene to an external site for testing, along with evidence that they collected against these suspects. Now, what's really interesting, Steph, is that the brothers of the three suspects that were arrested were actually arrested in the first few weeks after the murder. Remember when I told you that they arrested 11 suspects, arrested and charged 11 suspects, and then released them because they didn't have enough evidence? Well, some of the evidence that they collected were shoes from these brothers. And when they send the forensic testing off to an external site, they were able to collect blood splatter off of these shoes, and they tested the blood spatter against the DNA of Damilola. And what they come back with is that it's Damilola's blood splatter on the brothers' shoes. And so they asked the boys, were they involved? Were they there? And they're saying, we don't even know Damilola. We've never met this boy. Well, the police are like, if you never met him, how did his blood get on your shoe?
One
How was
plus
it
one
found on your shoe?
equaling like five here, sir.
Exactly. And so they decide these brothers are definitely, they believe, are the killers of Damilola. And I know you keep hearing me say these boys, the brothers, the boys. Well, I'm saying that because two of the three boys were minors. The brothers, Danny and Ricky Perdilla, they were 12 and 13 at the time of the killing. Now, the other suspect, he was 18 at the time that he was arrested, but he was eventually ruled out. So they only take Danny and Ricky to trial, where they charged them with the murder of Damilola. And the case was primarily circumstantial, but you've heard Steph and I talk for seasons, episodes about how circumstantial evidence can often be the most damning evidence against suspects, and not only that, defendants, but not only that, when you have a immense amount of circumstantial evidence, it can actually be even more persuasive than actual evidence itself. So while they didn't have, hard like an eyewitness, they did have DNA and forensic evidence, and they were able to place them in the area at the time of the crime. But the jury came back with a no guilty verdict for murder.
Stunned, the police and the prosecutors went back to the drawing board. They believed in their case. They knew Danny and Ricky committed this crime, but they realized they were being too lofty when they sought a murder conviction instead of manslaughter. The police believed, and the prosecutors painted the story that they believe occurred the day Damiola was killed as follows. Ricky and Danny saw Damiola walking home. They started taunting him and antagonizing him because they wanted something he had, more likely than not, the silver jacket he was wearing. In an attempt to get the jacket, they either accidentally or intentionally stabbed him with a broken bottle in the leg. It was never the boys' intention to murder Damiola. Their intention was to rob him.
And because the mens rea of the boys was not to kill, the jury could not come back with a conviction of murder. So mens rea, in layman's terms, it just basically means the guilty mind. It's a Latin word for the guilty mind. And what a person intends to do. It's what's going on in the mind of the person when they're committing the act. So here the jury felt like they couldn't convict the boys because their mens rea was not to kill. And a conviction of murder in London or the UK requires a mens rea of an intention to kill. And because they didn't believe that that was Danny and Ricky's mens rea, that was not what they were thinking at the time they attacked Damilola. They returned a verdict of not guilty because they believed that the mens rea of the boys was to simply steal from him. Now, the good thing is, manslaughter, as defined in London or the UK, would allow the prosecutors to convict the boys because even though they didn't intend to kill Damilola, even though they did not intend for Damilola to die, he did die in the act of committing another crime, and that fit under their definition of manslaughter. They retried Ricky and Danny for a second time. And finally, on the third trial for Damilola's killer, the jury found the brothers guilty of manslaughter and convicted them to 8 years in prison. And that's where we need to pause because a lot of you are probably listening and asking the same question that I asked, that I'm sure Steph asked, is how the heck did they only get 8 years? And how were they able to bring some of these cases? They had 3 cases that went to trial. How are they able to even bring some of these cases to trial? And specifically, how were they able to retry the boys, these brothers, after they got a no guilty verdict? Because, Steph, what do we call that here? Do you know what we call that here in the state? If you
Eh,
are tried and you're found not guilty, what do we call that in the state? If they try to try you again.
That's, the 3 not 3 strikes, but, what do you call it? Not
It's
3
a
strikes.
TV show that mom loves. Double
Double Jeopardy. It was a movie, yeah, Double Jeopardy. I couldn't think of that to save my
Jeopardy.
life.
And so in the States, you can't bring if they get a non-guilty verdict, you cannot retry them. Okay? You can't. It's against the Constitution. So to answer that, we have to talk about the law, specifically how the British legal system works. In England, criminal cases are prosecuted by the Crown Prosecution Service, which is, in other words, the CPS. Police investigates, but prosecutors decide whether charges move forward based on 2 tests. Is there a realistic prospect of conviction? And is prosecution in the public's interest? The United States does a similar test, but it's not so black and white. In the United States, prosecutors often build layered cases, right? We'll see multiple witnesses, plea deals, grand jury indictments, which is why it's unlikely that the case where Bromley was the sole witness would have ever went to trial in the United States. It just would have never went to trial because a good prosecutor, an average prosecutor would have said, I have one witness who's naming all 4 suspects, and this one witness is demanding inducements. This will fall apart in front of the jury, let alone a judge. Another major difference is age. The boys that were later convicted were just 12 and 13 at the time of the crime. And in England, children that young are almost always treated as juveniles. Sentences are capped and rehabilitation is the priority. That is not the case in the United States. Prosecutors could seek adult charges, including felony murder, which could open a child as young as 10, 11, 12 years old to sentencing exposures that could be decades, right? Even potentially life. And that's why many of you might be shocked by the 8-year sentence. But under UK law, judges are required to focus on rehabilitation, not retribution. And what I want to say, Steph, to that is our legal system in the United States was also designed with rehabilitation in mind. The prison systems were cultivated on the basis of rehabilitation. And often you'll still hear people say that prison is designed for rehabilitation, even though we do not have programs and systems that really would afford rehabilitation here in the United States. However, in England and the UK, British, they do something different and they really do try to stand behind this idea of rehabilitation.
And to that point, I've watched, and I know some of our listeners, I watched this show, Locked Up Abroad. Usually features people locked up, like, in third world countries. And so, you often hear, oh, I would hate to get locked up, you know, abroad because of that reason. However, I also have done like some just research because I'm curious, or have been curious about the UK and what they do in their prison systems, because they're known for rehabilitating people. And when you do that in Australia, just like a lot of those, overseas, closer to us in terms of how they work and the law and the things that they do in terms of their government, that is similar to ours, not exactly ours. You see what they do, and it's pretty impressive in comparison to the US. And while we're judging it based off of our experience over here in the US, I would say that my opinion is getting 8 years when you're a minor and actually trying to work to ensure that that person is rehabilitated when they come out into society, that they're a better person, seems to be the way to go. even if it's in theory, right? Like that seems to work out far better than what we have done to our youth because we treat prisons as a way to gain money and not to rehabilitate others. So,
Absolutely.
just an idea, just a thought. But 8 years after Ricky Preddy was released, he repeatedly violated probation, reoffended, and returned to prison, which is why I said it works in theory, not it's not always carried out in that way. In 2020, he was sentenced again, this time for driving a vehicle into a female police officer. Rehabilitation did not work for him, but that's the thing about rehabilitation. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Now, the Taylor family said it plainly. The system failed everyone involved, but out of unimaginable grief, Richard Taylor and his wife, Gloria, action. They founded the Damilola Taylor Trust, focusing on education, anti knife crime initiatives, and opportunity for at risk youth. Richard Taylor received an Officer of the Order of the British Empire award for his advocacy. He once said the young people are still killing themselves over nothing. But the Damiola Trust has started yielding fruits. He wanted to focus on ensuring the next child did not senselessly die.
Damiola Taylor was not just a victim. He was a child failed by multiple systems. And his story forces us to ask, is justice measured by years sentenced or by whether we prevent the next child from dying? And I think that that is what the Taylor family ultimately wanted to be his legacy. And so, while his story does force us to confront a very uncomfortable truth, our children, poor or Black children specifically, across the world, often placed in harm's way by neglect disguised as policy. It's a question I would love for you to think through and process. And, Steph, I would love to get your answer on that, specifically because when you think about how the housing estate that he lived in for years complained about just the overridden crime and how, they weren't getting, good quality lighting and just access to common things were not given and demanding that the police, the government get involved to turn things around, but they didn't. And they didn't until after Damilola's death. And now that area looks completely different. It's regentrified. It's a place that they're not trying to escape. It's a place that is not overwritten with crime. And so it makes you wonder, is this neglect disguised as policy?
Your initial question was, is justice measured by years sentence or by whether you prevent the next child from dying? And I think that's a very personal question for a person who was the family member of said victim, right? Because it's easy for me to say that, but I've never been in that particular situation. But I think it should be preventing the next child from dying, to ensure that the next child who is simply walking home, who's trying to reach home, that they get there because you put policies in place, you advocated, and that's what a lot of victims' families do. They, as cliche as it sounds, they turn their pain into purpose. They decide that, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and not just have my justice seemingly come from, in this case, 8 years from a guy who continuously reoffended, come from that. I'm going to make a change for the future generations, for the future kids that are just wanting to walk home. And I think to me, that's the more powerful initiative that his family was able to do. And that creates the most impact, in my opinion.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. And while Ricky did reoffend, his brother Danny did not. And so it just shows you the dichotomy of how Steph was explaining. In theory, it could work, but like there's still factors outside of this theoretical ideology that rehabilitation is what it's designed for. There's still outside factors, including the individual desiring to be rehabilitated, because there has to come a place within the offender that says, I want to be different. I want to make a change. I don't want to continue to come down to go down this path. So, it's one of those where you have to marry both the deterrence. I don't want to be here again, and the rehabilitation and hope that ultimately that person decides that that's enough. Ricky decided it wasn't, which is why he's still serving time in jail. Whereas Danny said, it is. It's enough. I don't want this. Steph, do you have any takeaways for this case?
This case is interesting, and I guess my most important takeaway that I wanna leave is that I believe regardless of where you are and how your government functions. And shout out to our listeners in the UK. We have several, so shout out to y'all. But what it means to me is that we're all humans, and we're far more alike than we are different. So to hear that the same type of injustice exists in London throughout the world, because if you want to just take it on a broader scale, it's a reminder that we all have more work to do. And if we just stop looking at us as, well, we're the US, or I'm black, I'm white, whatever we boast in our identity, and start boasting in our similarities, we would do more to protect each other. And so this case for me is just a reminder that we're the same, man. And we have to protect our youth. They are some of the most vulnerable in our society, and we have to do our due diligence. And I admire the Taylor family for everything that they did during and after Damiola's death.
I love that takeaway, Steph. I don't really have a takeaway as much as I just have a couple highlights. And that is, I want to highlight the police because there were systems that failed Damilola and their family in terms of just the housing estate and how overrun and how poverty stricken it was and how they did not come in to make those changes. And while those systems did fail, the police fought hard to find this killer. They made sure that while those systems failed, they were not going to be yet another failure to the Damilola Taylor's family. And they may have gotten it wrong a couple of times, named some wrong people, and we could sit there and talk about the injustice of that because it is, right? Like for those four individuals that came, to trial and were eventually found not guilty and ultimately were not the people that committed this crime, it's definitely injustice for them, and I'm sure they have a story on that. But it didn't stop the police from fighting to find the right people. And then I want to honor the Taylor family, like Steph said. I just think that I am always amazed at families who are victimized, who choose to honor instead of becoming bitter, because it is a choice. How we respond to anything in life is our choice. And we can choose to have, a bitter, angry, negative, and even rightful attitude against the injustices that came against Damilola, or they could choose to say, we're going to turn this around and leave a legacy for Damilola that will impact generations. And when you go to that community today, when you go to the Peckham estate, housing estate, the North Peckham housing estate, there is a building that is dedicated to Damilola. And I think that that is because of how the Taylors chose to honor instead of becoming bitter.
So that is our case for today. We want to encourage you, if you are listening to us on YouTube, to make sure you subscribe, keep us in your algorithm, make sure you press that bell sign so you can get notifications on when we drop our episodes on Thursday. I also want to encourage everybody to head on over to Substack, where we're trying to curate conversation and community. As I said in a subscriber edition, listen. I know I'm asking you to come join another social media app, but listen, I promise it's worth it, because it's there where you will find just articles that are based on the episodes that we feature here. You get more in depth where we ask you questions. That's where you can come and answer. You guys know you can interact with us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.